Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Preparing for the Future. This is the final session in our four-part series. I'm Sean Magali from the Preservica team. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. In the meantime, please feel free to say hello in the chat or feel free to share about where you're tuning in from. I'm in the Boston area here today. We're having a gorgeous day out there. I just had my lunch outside with the dogs and it was fantastic, but I'm happy to be here with you all now. Also, as a quick reminder, as I mentioned earlier today is the final session. In case you missed any of the previous events, I wanted to let you know that we've posted all of the content from each of these sessions in the Preservica Community Hub. This is a special area on our online community hub that we've built out especially for the members of this training. So please check that out. We'll be sure to send a link with our follow-up. We'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you.
Good day, everyone, and welcome. Following up on Sean's comments, so glad to have you today. My name is Lori Ashley, and I've been facilitating this session of training, and we are delighted to have you and are so grateful for your time attending these sessions. We have a few really great sessions today, and one of them is from the Chief Innovation Officer for Preservica, John Tilbury. His session is recorded, and it's the evolving landscape of information management. And John has been at the forefront of Preservica's development, and so he's got some really great ideas of what's ahead and what we can expect as practitioners to be dealing with in the future, and hopefully some innovations that will help us do our jobs. We are also being joined today by Dara Hoffman, who is a professor at San Jose State University and uses Starter in her teaching, and she's going to share her experience with us and some great insights. And then Christine Ardern will be joining us as well. We'll have a brief recap on the training series from our Aubrey Shanahan, and then we'll wrap up and invite you to attend the user group meeting. So on to the next slide. I just have a couple of housekeeping items here. So next slide, please. Thank you to ARMA Canada and to the Association of Canadian Archivists for helping us to promote this series. We've had great attendance. We hope that you're able to use Starter in between these sessions. And that you're moving forward and gaining momentum for your digital preservation practice. So on to the next slide, please. So here are our speakers, Dara and Christine and Aubrey. And again, John Tilbury will be joined in a recorded session. So we are almost at the end of our series. We've gone from Digital Preservation 101. Paul covered a lot of essential skills of how using Starter to do ingest and preservation actions, metadata transfer and editing, how you can make your collections publicly available. Then the third session we talked about, okay, you're going to need some resources, you're going to need some technology, you're going to need continuing resources. So how can we help you identify gaps, identify the value of your collections, and advance to persuade other stakeholders about the need that you have for digital preservation capabilities. And today we're going to look forward because our work is never done. Even though many of you are focused on preserving the past, you must be ready for what's coming down the pike and to create the environment and the resources and the infrastructure to be able to handle the assets that you'll be protecting into the future. So we will round out our session today. And then look forward to maybe seeing you online and in the startup community in the future. Next slide, please. This is just my one slide. Our Canadian friends may be aware that in the United States, we're having a bit of an investigation into some events that took place last year that were very, very disturbing. And one of the things that's happened in the recent days is that some of the Secret Service messages, the text messages that were created around the time of the January 6th events were wiped out. The agents were supposed to save them, and there was a backup done, and now there's a missing record. And so this is just one of the examples of how digital transformation is changing our lives and bringing new challenges to us every day. In this case, what we might have assumed already, text messages were federal records. We now have an order from the Department of Defense making sure that going forward these records will not be lost. So with that, I want to hand over to the recorded session from John Tilbury, and I hope that you find this very, very interesting, what he sees coming in the future.
Right, okay, so I am going to take you through really where digital preservation is starting to head in the future. When we started this series, we were thinking about the past, how we got here and where we are. And digital preservation is still very new. It's still something that relatively small people know about, and it's still something that tends to be done by people who know what digital preservation is and that know what they're doing or try to know what they're doing. But really, that is going to change quite significantly in the future. Digital preservation as a craft cannot keep up with the dynamic nature of the IT industry. It can't keep up with the sheer scale of the information that's hitting it and the increasing complexity of the information that's hitting it. And it can't keep up with the variety of people that are going to start needing digital preservation, but that who want it to just work and don't want to get involved in the mechanics and don't want to do all the decision making. They just want a magic wand that makes it better. Now, we know that's quite hard, but that's really what we're going to have to move to if we want digital preservation to become as ubiquitous as it needs to be a valued part of the IT landscape. So that's what we're going to look at here, some of the things that are going to drive that change and will result from it. So I'm going to go through 5 things that I think will become part of the digital preservation landscape fairly soon. So the first challenge we have is that there are waves of complex information hitting us that we need to preserve. A lot of these are in proprietary systems, and a lot of them are more complicated data types. So continuous streams of information, they can't be manually curated. You can't manually go through this list of things, tick them and say, yeah, those are the ones I want. There's just too much stuff. And secondly, each part of information is made up of multiple files. Even if you want to download each thing individually, you couldn't because it's complicated. And when it's in your preservation system, you want to interact with it holistically. So here are some examples. The most obvious example is Twitter, and Twitter is obviously in the news at the moment and is, whatever you think of their current change of ownership, likely to change. And so preserving tweets has come to the fore again. And tweets are a continuous stream. They have a complex relationship to other tweets, but each tweet comprises a database entry, potentially up to 4 images, potentially 1 movie, and a link to a website, or multiple links to websites, as long as hashtags and mentions and so on. So to just take a screenshot of a tweet, or to download the HTML from the twitter.com is losing a vast majority of the information that's held about that tweet. That is a lossy process. Also, it's extremely slow and labor intensive. So digital preservation systems in the future will have to move to 2 things. First of all, continuous harvesting using APIs. So we have set up a system to harvest named accounts of Twitter accounts as a first toe in the pool of this sort of system. Really, the same applies to Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all of which have complex licensing rules and copyright challenges that need to be navigated. We have a license to the Twitter API to be able to do this, but it'll just get complicated. But the problem will be one of copyright and licensing, because once you're done, you'll be able to just download stuff. And you'll have to treat each posting on these things as what we call a multi-part asset. In other words, in Twitter, you have the database entry and the images and movies and so on, but they're a single asset. The information is a single thing. So on the left-hand side here, you have a tweet I did of my prize-winning tulips. I say that because they won a prize at the iPres Tulip competition. That's the sort of thing we do at digital preservation conferences. And that was on twitter.com. We extracted that, we turned it into multi-part asset so that when we render it in Preservica, it looks pretty much exactly the same, because we have all of the information we need to mimic the Twitter API experience. And we have to do that under the license terms. So you can see here that that enables us to fully automate the process. And that very much is going to be the future of digital preservation. Automatic harvesting and treating information objects as complex multi-part assets under the bonnet, so the user doesn't have to worry about it. The next thing is that employees don't want to learn about digital preservation, but they know they need to do it. Someone has read up that these records are vital records and we need to preserve them for a long time, but they don't want to go on the digital preservation course. In fact, they just want to use their day-to-day system, which for many organizations is Microsoft 365. So we've used this as an example for Microsoft 365, by which we mean the hosted version of SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and Outlook. We need to be able to digitally preserve critical assets out of those systems and retrieve them into those systems. So as far as the user is concerned, those are preserved records, but they only ever use Microsoft. Now, this is, to some extent, the Holy Grail, because we then know that there is a direct link from all the 365 services to digital preservation. Manual transfer, you can do manual transfer. In other words, I need to transfer this record, so this file or this email or this Teams posting or this file out of OneDrive, or you can drive it by retention labels. That is, you can send up a retention labeling system, either manual or automated, that says all things in this folder system have this label, which says preserve them. Or I'm going to use Microsoft's really clever AI stroke machine learning capabilities to flag items that I know are need preserving. So anything with a credit card number in it, or anything with a bank account number in it, or anything with these keywords in it, make sure you preserve those. But when I need to retrieve them, I want to use them from Microsoft 365. So Microsoft 365 is an example here. It's an example of what the future will look like, that users will only ever interact with the preservation system from within their database system. We've made a start on this, and here are some very early rough cuts of the sort of thing we're doing, that in SharePoint, they would right-click it from a context menu, click on copy, click on send to archive, boom, job done. You've copied that to the archive. That is the extent of the ingest process they need to know about. As far as they're concerned, that's preserved. That's it, job done. It'll come up with a little logo saying that is set, but end of job. They can do a whole folder, they can do a whole library, they can do a whole site. They can pick which subfolders they want to include, and they can either copy, i.e. put a copy in the Preservica, but keep it in SharePoint, or they can move, which means once it's safely in SharePoint, in Preservica, delete it from SharePoint or OneDrive or Exchange. And again, that's all they do. They can even do lists. They can do posts. So here's the button at the top, click on archive at the top, and then that list item out of the list is preserved into Preservica. And that's the future. But it's more exciting than that, because that's just sending things. That's chucking it across the wall. What if at a later date they go, actually, I've now deleted that stuff out of my Microsoft world. I want to get it back again. So what they want to do is they want to be able to search for stuff and see it there. Ah, that's the thing I want, and retrieve it back into SharePoint. And this is what we're adding. So you can see here, this item, basic document, is in Preservica, but it shows up in a search from within SharePoint. And if they click on restore, it pulls it back into SharePoint. Or if they click on open, it opens it, but from within a Microsoft context, preserving all the same permissions, but allowing them to interact with the information solely from in their day-to-day system. So this is really quite a big step forward, that Outlook, you could set up a labeling system in Outlook that went through everyone's emails, labeled the emails according to some criteria, and that stuff got automatically preserved. The user, subject to them signing up to GDPR permission criteria, etc., doesn't even know it's being done. So that is a very exciting future for digital preservation. However, that starts to push us into an area in which the people using digital preservation haven't got a clue about how to digitally preserve stuff. So what we need to do is to create a completely automated file format preservation system. They need to be able to use, as a non-expert system, digital preservation, but that according to some recommended set of rules that maybe their administrator has some impact after, or decision making over, or they just click save defaults, use defaults, just does stuff. And the key problem here is that stuff changes. So you might think the normalization rules you use today are all you'll ever need. Well, it's simply not true. The rate of change in digital preservation and new file formats coming out is too big. So here are some practical examples. If you're doing a photography database, Canon has just released a format called Canon Raw V3, which is the digital master that comes off a high-end digital camera. I've just bought one myself and was surprised to find this new format coming off it, which I'd never seen before. So that was added in. Currently, the previous version of Pronom would identify that as an MP4. And so it'd think it's a film and try and migrate it, or try and interact with it as a film, which would fail because it's not really an MP4, it's really a Canon Raw V3. Now, if you identify that now, it'll say, oh, that's a Canon Raw V3. Do you want to migrate that to JPEG for consumption? But that means there are a lot of things that went in before that are wrongly identified as MP3. So you need to automatically go back through the database and re-identify things that might be wrong. Another example is the new Apple image format, HEIC. Well, it's a generic standard, but produced by the same people who did JPEG, but Apple has taken it up. It's better quality and more compressed, so it's good, but it's not as ubiquitous as JPEG. In the future, almost certainly everything will be HEIC, or however you pronounce it. There are huge debates about that. And JPEG will cease to exist, or cease to be widely supported. So that would be a change. And also you get bugs in digital preservation tools that have done migrations. Some of these, a lot of these things are third-party reverse engineered tools and turned out don't work in this special set of undocumented circumstances. All of that stuff shows that change happens, and it happens all the time. So what we need is a fully automated system to recharacterize content as it happens. The user doesn't know it's happening. We need to push recommended migration options, which users can subscribe to. And as the recommendations change, bugs are fixed, users' choices change, the whole lot is brought back into step with whatever the best practice is now. The user doesn't have to run workflows, they don't have to make decisions. They make a change on setting, the server wakes up, glows hot for about a month, and suddenly everything's back in step again. So that means the content is always in step with the policy, and the user doesn't have to do any really complicated stuff. So that's what we're now rolling out. We're doing some large-scale testing that on pronom updates. And in the future, the user will just make some settings. And if that settings is accept all defaults, we will take responsibility for making sure the collection is in the most appropriate format and is identified in the most appropriate way. The tidal wave of information also is struggling for professionals to keep up with classifying. And that automatically identifying information, automatically characterizing it, so classifying it, saying, that contains some PII. That's a picture of John Tilbury. That's got some sensitive stuff in it. That relies on individuals to go through the information and do it. And clearly that is not sustainable as growth occurs. So that brings us on to cognitive automation in all its forms. And so in the future, we're going to have shared approaches to things like facial recognition, sensitivity tagging, keyword analysis. And that means using artificial intelligence, machine learning, all variants of those technologies to do the work for us. But for us to be able to trust that, I think we're going to have to do a lot more sharing on things like publishing test data sets, sharing the rules we use, sharing the results, how do we optimize it, etc. But there are many, many good examples of this working in practice. We know that the archives in Illinois worked with the University of Illinois to come up with ways to keep emails, and they found over 300,000 extra emails they really should keep just by trying to mimic what an archivist would do. So there are many good examples of this, but it just isn't used in production enough. It's still a research project, and we all need to move on to trusting this, but sharing the way we trust it fairly soon. Now, if we're going to trust the preservation system to be the source of the truth, the next thing we need to do is really to be sure that that trust is not misplaced. And as preservation products become very widespread and cloud and hosted and shared by everyone, we really need to be sure that they are trustworthy. So we in Preservica spend a lot of time looking in the mirror and going, are we sustainable? Is that going to keep going? Can we keep supporting the customers? What if we run into trouble? What do we do, etc., as any good preservation system should do. And it must be based on more than just, is the source code open source? Because to some extent, that's the least of your worries. It's, do you still have money to exist? Do you have the operations and governance? Do you rely on key individuals? If I go under a bus, what happens to Preservica? You need to audit against a set of criteria to say, hold on, are all of those things still working? And the best example of this is the unfortunate case of the Digital Preservation Network, DPN, that failed. It was open source, it had loads of customers, but it failed. It ran out of money. And, you know, that's it's sad. I take no pleasure in this. It's a bad example of within our profession. But it's an example of what goes wrong when you focus on the wrong things for sustainability. And so we have now published our way forward on this, our Digital Preservation Sustainability Charter. We are audited against that by our customers and third parties. We demonstrate that we cover the data. So can customers get their data back? Can they get the source code to the software? Are our operations up to snuff and fully thought through? Do we have knowledge transfer to make sure that no key individual is critical? Do we have the finance to sustain? And that's probably one of the most important things. And do we have our governance in place to make sure that we track against all of these, and are our environmental credentials appropriate to what we're trying to achieve? So we've published all this. It's open, anyone else can have a go at it, and we think this is a much broader definition of sustainability to show what we're doing, and other providers will also do the same, I'm sure, to show how they will persist for the very long term, which is after all we're on about. So those are 5 areas where I think digital preservation is going to change in the future. It's going to move to a more integrated, automated approach, both in terms of integration with live systems, dealing with complex data. It's going to be able to retrieve information back into live systems. And a lot of the digital preservation hard work and intellectual energy that has been a feature of digital preservation up to now will become fully automated within a sustainable and trustable system. So those are some aspects of digital preservation in the future that I think are going to happen. That's the direction we're heading.
Great. I hope you enjoyed that. John's always fun to listen to. He's been in this field for quite a long time, and he's just always churning forward and thinking about what comes next. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and we can talk a little bit in your questions if you have some. And I think that maybe Aubrey can help clarify too a comment about file format preservation and its automation, because that's something that happens in Starter, which is a good benefit, and we could talk more about that. So moving on, I would like to introduce Dara Hoffman. San Jose State University School of Information, and particularly the Master of Archives and Records Administration program, is the only teaching license using Preservica in the United States, but it was adopted by someone probably you all know, Pat Franks, who just came off a term as NAGARA president, but she's been active in the field for a long time. And Dara has stepped into Pat's very substantial shoes to lead this program, and she's going to talk about using Starter in her classes and give us some perspective on the practitioners that are coming up into the future to deal with all this stuff that John was talking about. So take it away, Dara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. I am thrilled to be here today. And I really enjoyed listening to John's talk, because from my perspective as a researcher, that's exactly where all of our energy is going right now, trying to figure out how we could possibly make this automated and manageable so everything's not lost like we're facing with so much of the digital assets from the 80s and 90s. So thanks again for having me. I'm going to talk specifically about my experience. So Pat uses our education license to teach the full big Preservica, as we jokingly call it, in one of our Mara classes. I actually use Starter in one of my classes that is aimed primarily at our library students on digital curation. Next slide, please. So this class, Digital Curation, it is an elective course in our Archives and Records elective stream for library students. And it is one of the courses for our Digital Asset Certificate. And it is super intense. It's intense to teach. I can't imagine it's any less intense to take. So basically, over the course of 13 weeks, we go through the entire digital curation lifecycle. I sometimes joke that to be a good digital curation professional, you have to be something of a librarchivist. You need all of those librarian skills at the top of the life cycle, and then those hardcore digital preservation archival skills at the bottom of the life cycle. And most of the topics in those 13 weeks have their own class available within the iSchool. So I teach metadata in 1 week. It is a lot. And my students are MLIS students. I do a survey when they come in at the beginning of each semester. The vast majority are just like when I ask, say, I don't really know what digital curation is, but I want to do the certificate. And so here I am. I don't have metadata. I have digital nothing. What is digital preservation? So they're very much neophytes. But after the first semester, the thing that most of them said was, you know, like this is interesting and stuff. We get, you know, your terror over the fact that we're going to lose everything, but we want hands-on experience. Next slide, please. And so this is the life cycle. For those of you who aren't familiar with, it is basically OAS in that preserve part at the bottom, the Open Archival Information Systems. And then the curation system is everything from, you know, conceptualizing, because ideally if you're curating, you'll be there working with the records creators to think about what they need and how long they'll need it and what formats and all of that good stuff. And then it walks through, you know, from creation or reception of the records, appraisal, selection, all that OAIS, you know, ingest, preserve, store. And then the part that's very different from the way we often think about digital preservation is it's about, you know, ultimately how are we going to not just access, use, reuse, but transform these records into something new. And so this is a lot to take in for folks who have, you know, zero digital background and typically zero archival background. I maybe have 1 or 2 archival students per semester in this course, but most of the time it's, you know, I'm not just having to teach digital curation, but, you know, when I say appraise and select, okay, let's talk about what appraisal means and how that is similar to and different from, say, selection and weeding in a library context. So it's a lot. Next slide, please. And so in order to give the students the hands-on experience that they needed and wanted, I needed something with low technical barriers to entry. My students were not necessarily in a place where they would be setting up, say, a DSpace instance and running anything like that. I needed something that was financially viable on my enormous budget of $0. I needed something where my students could actually practice the skills we were talking about in class. So, you know, like I said, we do metadata in 1 week, but by the end of the semester, they put together some mods metadata on their objects. And finally, I wanted something that actually aligned with the standards I was preaching. When I'm telling them OAIS is important, when I'm telling them, okay, we should look at the track checklist for digital repositories, I wanted something that actually matched what I was preaching. And so I talked to the illustrious Pat Franks and said, what should I do? And Pat Franks' solution was, next slide, please. Preservica, yay! And specifically, we chose Starter as opposed to like the enterprise version, partly because, of course, the education license was being used by Pat for our Mara students, but also because Starter really is, like the name says, a really low barrier place to start. If you're someone out there who, you know, because this series started with Digital Preservation 101, my students are somewhere prior to Digital Preservation 101, right? They're going, what is digital preservation? And so I found Starter is it's got a very intuitive user interface. It's a very low barrier to entry solution. Next slide, please. And so there were some challenges. This will be my 5th semester, I think, teaching Starter. But at the beginning, I had to learn Preservica alongside that first set of students because, you know, I'm an academic, I'm not a practitioner. But the good news is it's actually very learnable and even I could do it. And sometimes the students wanted to do things like works that weren't there quite yet. They are now, but at the time I started using Starter, it wasn't there yet. And I love that I used the words cough, cough, work, and the AI decided it needed a picture of lungs. And then group work. Getting the students able to coordinate their work, to all be part of a collection, to participate. Starter, at least the version we were using, as it was at the very beginning, it took a lot of work on our side to figure out how to work with that interface in a group setting. That said, it has been a super valuable, because the very first set of students we did as individuals, and then we moved into group work. And it's been really great because they've been able to bring their different strengths to the work, to figure out how to work with that, you know, limited either mods or DC, the set metadata schema, and really make it work for an incredibly varied set of collections. Next slide, please. So this is my first little guy here. Like I said, I had to learn Preservica along with the students. As you can see, I didn't even bother really with any metadata, but it's super intuitive and fun to use, I found. And so I have my own little collection that I occasionally bust out for the students, full of my memes, because I love memes, to just show that it's super doable. Next slide, please. So now, semester by semester, because of course there's a learning curve for teaching the software as well as using it, I feel like we're getting to a really good place in terms of how we use Preservica Starter with the students. Next slide, please. So where we are now, I actually don't teach Preservica myself anymore in terms of the how to use it. There's a bunch of wonderful videos, how-tos, as well as the community hubs. And so I was able to roll those out to the students this semester. And so they really enjoyed listening to, say, Rebecca Davis's charming accent as opposed to my horrible Kentucky Canadian hybrid. But the videos and the how-tos are all very accessible and the students enjoy them. And we've had amazing projects. When I was doing them as individual students, probably the one that was most meaningful is one of my students who was able to use Starter to preserve and arrange his late mother's digital camera files. And so now he was able to share that out with the family and to do a project that really meant a lot to him. One of my favorite group projects so far, they used Starter they went through the AIDS quilt project and found all of the deaf folks in the AIDS quilt and created their own sub-collection. They, ingested and brought everything over that they call the Deaf AIDS quilt. And so they're able to really transform. They use, lots of publicly available materials, or else I've also had students who have done things, especially students who are in small institutions already, have used it to as a preservation solution right there at work, to be able to, ingest and preserve collections that they didn't know what to do with, that their work wasn't sure what to do with. And so the student projects that they've been able to do with Starter have been really meaningful. I've been impressed every semester. It seems like they learn more and more things. So one of them was like, oh, now I know how to bulk ingest metadata. Look how fast and cool that was. And what's really been wonderful about using Starter in the class is that the students have been able to let me know, hey, I went on a job interview and I was able to say, yeah, I have some experience using these kinds of tools and I understand how to, do metadata on a digital object. And, it's really helped them. And they have come to me and said, I am now able to, in my workplace, talk about the things we need to consider in terms of digital preservation, in terms of digital curation, and to say, what, I know something really hands-on, low barrier to entry, everyone here can do it. Why don't we look at this solution and be able to find a good solution for, again, a lot of my students most of my students are already practicing working librarians and archivists, and a lot of them work in very small institutions. They work for a little town archive or a small community archive, and so it's been really great for them to be able to come out with some hands-on experience and to be able to apply those skills right away, and to be able to now sit at the table with an expertise and an authority that they didn't necessarily have before, to insert the importance of digital preservation and digital curation for their organizations. Next slide, please. And so I was putting these slides together last night and I got this email from a student. And I was like, oh, this is just perfect timing, because she emailed to say, hey, I really liked Preservica and I was wondering how long we can have access to the accounts we made. And I was able to say, hey, it's Starter. As far as I know, you have it as long as Preservica's around. Look into all the sustainability stuff we talked about in the semester and make your own assessment. So now from John's talk, I can point to the sustainability charter as well. But it's been just a really great experience for me, of course, as an instructor, but I think really for the students to be able to go out and apply and dig in. I always enjoy the fact that I make them write a little proposal at the beginning of the semester about what their project will be about how they're going to manage the workflow, what they're going to try to preserve, and what kind of collection they're putting together. And invariably in that first proposal, they are always like, we want to do 150 items. And then I come back and say, you're a beginner, it's a 13-week semester, and there's only 3 of you in your group. You're going to do 12. And there's always sort of a only 12. And then by the end of the semester, once they've realized how much goes into doing a collection manually like that, they go, oh, yes, I see now. This is so involved. I also really love all of the exemplars because those have proven a useful tool, of course, for me to teach. Okay, let's look at, Rebecca's collection here. Let's look at how they do the metadata. Let's look at how they arrange things. Let's look at how they've made things visible. But again, it also provides a tool. I've been told that they go out with their institutions to say, look, here's another little town just like us, and here's what they've been able to do to start to address some of these issues. So it's been a really good experience for us, and I feel really grateful that Pat introduced me to Lori, and we've gotten great support from Preservica throughout this process. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and I probably went far too fast, as I always do, but thank you for your time.
Thanks, Dara. It's been really fun to watch the progression, and I know, Pat is such an amazing leader, and it's great that you've taken up the cause. And I think you raised some points that we had made before about Starter, is that lowering the barrier and lowering the price point. As Aubrey shared last time in the session, you only need to go to an archives conference to hear over and over again that archivists are really strained in terms of having the resources, and that the tools and the software can be out of reach financially. And so that was part of the motivation behind Preservica's Starter product, was to say, okay, here it is. And nobody expects you to stay with 5 gigabytes for the rest of your life, right? I mean, I think like John said, there's some things in Starter that are automated. The file format preservation just happens. You don't get to choose, right? And it only has 2 metadata schemas, but those get you started. And as soon as you start to feel the tension in what you want to do and what you can do, well, that's a part of the business planning process, right? About justifying and moving forward and getting the resources that you need as you decide what to do, and you grow in your own capabilities to preserve things. So I think just that little bit of hands-on can be so powerful in helping your students prepare, to do what they do in their current jobs, or whatever they end up doing in the future.
Yes, that's a great point. And one of the things I hadn't really thought about, being trained in archives myself, is how much these problems are ending up sort of in the laps of folks with no archival background, but they're the librarian, they're a museum worker, they're they're an information professional in that bigger umbrella. And so these problems are being brought to them. And so for them to have something that doesn't require them necessarily to be an archivist, a records professional, but still be able to solve the problems for their organizations has been really powerful.
Yep, that's great. Well, so you're just on the cusp of your new semester, so we really appreciate the time that you took to be with us, and hang in there because there may be some questions that come up. And
now
pleasure. We'll go ahead and transition over to Christine. So thank you, Dara, so very much.
Thank you.
So now let me introduce Christine, who's come to my my life through my connection to Dr. Charles Dollar, who I mentioned in a couple of sessions ago. I worked with him on the digital preservation capability and maturity model. And like Charles, Christine is an Emmett Leahy Award winner, and that's an award that recognizes really substantial contributions in the records management and archives professional internationally. So the last time I saw Christine in person was in 2019 when we were at the Emmett Leahy Award and dinner in Washington, D.C. But besides all of that, Christine has been a consultant for a good long time and has seen it and heard it and done it. She's a former president of ARMA International, a board member, a fellow, and currently sits on the Sagest editorial board, which is where we also had a touch point when she invited me to write a paper. So in winter 2020, I wrote a white paper on integrating digital preservation with information governance. So as you can tell, I'm very fond of Christine, and I invited her to join us today to talk about what she sees for the future, and I think give us all a little kick in the pants about what we might be thinking that we might do. So you go ahead and take it away, Christine. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Laurie. It's tough to look at the future, but certainly looking at what John has proposed was partly the thought that I had about something similar to privacy by design, which for those of you who are familiar with Anne Cavoukian, you would know basically that her proposal for privacy is it should be in systems development right from the get-go rather than a manual thing that we have to deal with later on. And certainly preservation by design seems to be the way to go with some of this. So what I have done is actually put together a few slides with just some thoughts from my perspective based on a few years in this profession. So next slide, please, Sean. Just for some of you who don't know me, and there are probably quite a few, I started in this profession, and I hate to say this, and you can do the math, in 1975. And have been involved as an archivist, a records manager, a consultant, and an instructor over the years since then. And as Laurie mentioned, Charles Dollar and I have known each other for a long time. He and I were on a committee for the Society of American Archivists together, believe it or not, in 1982. But since that time, really, I have had to deal with the transition, both as a professional archivist and records manager for the Salvation Army and CIBC and the Art Gallery of Ontario, dealing with this transition and where we're going, and is there a silver bullet? And I'd say we've been wishing for that silver bullet for the last umpteen years, and it certainly hasn't come. And the technology is constantly changing. But as Kyle shared with you in developing the business plan from Library and Archives Canada, it's absolutely impeccable or incredibly important that you actually get into creating strategic plans for your programs, and especially now dealing with digital preservation. Now, as a good archivist, next slide, please, Sean, I had to go back and look really to just put all of this into perspective. John's talking Twitter. And when I was going through some of the research to look at this, I was trying to understand the background and sort of the urgency within digital preservation. I mentioned 1982 at SAA, and at that particular point, the concern was large databases and information. But if we look at the history, and there was pre the Gutenberg printing press, certainly clay tablets, but look at where we have come from between the creation of the printing press and the creation of the first personal computer. That was over 530 years. That was a long time where we had opportunities to set rules and create programs and processes. And we've had 50 years from the first PC to today, and look at how that's changed. And then the World Wide Web beginning 30 years from our day to day. So if we look at the speed with which technology has impacted what we're doing, we're getting into some critical times here in terms of solutions to this, which may change our own professions. Next slide, please, Sean. I wanted to put this in because as an instructor and also just from a practical perspective, when you start to look at what does the future look like, looking at the increase in the volume of information, obviously is where do some of the experts see it going? And when you look at the volumes here of the zettabytes of information that are projected up to 2025, it's substantially increasing. Now, obviously, as archivists and records managers, we're not going to need to manage all of that, but the volumes that our own organizations are creating and the entities through which we report are going to be impacted, and certainly the information volumes will increase, and our manual habits are not going to be sufficient to keep us where we need to be to get a hold on this in the future. Next slide, please, Sean. So let's just step back a bit and see why the archivists have really taken the lead in a lot of this, and especially with the National Archives in the UK and Australia. A lot of the times previously, the data that was collected from research entities, such as some of the NASA space surveys or the Mars research, was maintained on tape. And over time, that tape disappeared. So all of the research information that was gathered over those years disappeared. And suddenly we came up with the OAIS model, which some of you will be definitely familiar with. Certainly what Preservica has been based on that. And the records management community wasn't as involved in dealing with electronic records in the 1980s and 1990s because we were still relating to the paper. Everything had to be printed. That was the way the laws were in place. IT really in the early years, well, not so much focused on long-term retention because the printouts were there, and it was largely the tapes and the large databases that created the challenges. And as we know, the philosophy at that point was storage is cheap, so let's just keep adding more to it. So we found that the communities and national archivists became leaders in digital preservation strategies. Organizations like the International Council of Archives, Society of American Archivists, and those groups were doing research into some of the issues that we're now facing. Next slide, please, Sean. So let's take a look at where we are today. And these are some of my thoughts, not necessarily where we're going, but it's really heartening to see that Dara, as some of the students coming through with the future who are going to be looking after this information, are learning about digital preservation as a critical part of the courses that they're working with. So is it fair to say, and this is my thought again, that many of today's processes, practices, and activities, both in records management and in the archives community, have been built on largely paper-based content? And we're going to have to rethink some of that going forward, depending on how the technology can work. And certainly with organizations with Preservica, where the participants in the development of the tool are providing input, some of our traditions can then be translated into some of the solutions for the future in terms of automated techniques and bringing in the types of things that John was talking about in his presentation. The question that I have is, if we don't have digital preservation as part of the day-to-day processes, are we going to be assured that that information will be available long-term? Even if we look at some of the IT collections that we have today, IT departments don't know what they have. It's impossible, and we're dealing with subjects like disposable disposition that's defensible. So we can't go back and look at all the content. In some of the cases, the programs may not be there even to read what's on those tapes. So what do we do with it? We can't continue going forward. We have to have some solution that's going to be completely transparent and automated. And I think John alluded to Preservica having that capacity in the future. And certainly most of the software tools that we're seeing now are aware of this particular issue, and it's going to have to be part of a standard process going forward. Now, my particular perspective, and Laurie and I were talking about this earlier on, is why do we look at this? We've been involved with it for so many years, and change seems to be so slow. But I think part of the challenge that we have is it's so big, it's such a huge challenge, and it's not something that's typical for any of us to actually become familiar with in terms of courses in universities or things that we are actually learning about on a day-to-day basis. Plus, we have priorities in our organizations and limited budgets. So I think one of the issues for us going forward is that it can't be just about archivists trying to solve this or records managers trying to solve this. It has to be in that information governance framework, if you want to put it in that much bigger scale, that all of these groups collaborate to address the process and the programs to build in digital preservation right from the creation phase of this information, not when it gets to the end of the life cycle, so that we have systems and strategies and activities in place that are completely transparent but are manageable. And I think for me personally, there may be some requirements to look at priorities within some of the programs that we're operating. I know backlogs are a huge concern for the archival community, but sometimes I think, well, that information is already in your archives. What about all the information that's out there that's being created digitally, electronically, that may not be saved if we aren't out there in the discussion phases, as well as worrying about the backlogs? Next slide, please. So I think it's fair to say, as I showed you, Twitter was created in 2006, Facebook 2004. Look at the impact that they have had on us. And as John was showing, Preservic has found a way to be able, or created a way to be able to capture these particular types of documentation, which are different from what we had 30 years ago, in a way that they're kept as an entity unto the complete history of the way that it was created. So I think, while I hate to say it, we're going to have new technologies and software that are being created. And even as John mentioned, Canon coming out with a new format, the volumes of digital information are just going to increase. And the historical volumes are going to increase. And appraisal will change. How do we look at the core of the information and ensure that we're getting that's required for not just historical research, but for long-term preservation? If you're in an organization where you're maintaining student records, for example, or you're dealing with a utility where you have to keep histories of the tools that you've used or the plants that have been created, elevators, histories of the actual implementation and maintenance of those elevators. So we have long-term records and they will change, but going forward, the methods that we use to actually capture the information and store it are going to have to be updated substantially. And I think the risk of the loss of information is going to increase if we do not get into the forefront of this and become active in the discussion phases. And that long-term content has to be part of a strategic priority. We can't obviously just turn around and go out and buy the software, but if you're looking at a strategic plan within your organization, then building in this practice to support the strategy within the organization, its business practices, as Kyle mentioned, I think becomes an important part of this. So become part of the strategic solution as well. Next slide, please. And another aspect of this, I think, which is absolutely critical and may not be in everybody's comfort level, but it's being out there, it's being in the forefront, it's selling the whole idea of digital preservation and the importance of it to key stakeholders and to those with whom you actually share business plans and deal on a regular basis. So our long-held practices, will they change? I suspect so. I think John mentioned the research that's being done between two partners in the States. Those are the types of initiatives that need to happen to see how our current practices can be evolved to meet the needs as we're going forward. Some of the principles may stay the same, but the actual way in which they're delivered is going to change because of the technology. And I know this is one that's a sore point with a lot of people, but maybe the backlogs will have to wait until some of these processes are actually implemented and in place. Some of you will shoot me for saying that, but I know we have issues and we've got priorities to deal with. Next slide, please. So I think from my perspective, just looking at this session, the software has really helped me look at how some of these changes are going to be built in going forward. And certainly with Starter, it gives you a really good opportunity to become comfortable with what the software can do. If you are the person who's promoting digital preservation within your organization, having this as a tool to go forward and explain what it can do is going to help you sell the whole process. And the key to my mind is finding someone within the organization who's going to be a champion for you, someone who's going to be supportive, who's going to find the budget for you, and who is going to be a partner with you in terms of moving this whole process forward. Next slide, please, Sean. Now, I had some key messages to make, and I think these were really going forward. We can stay where we are and we can actually just carry on doing what we've always done in the hopes that this problem gets resolved. I think it's important to say that it's not going to slow down, so therefore a risk assessment in terms of your programs and what are your priorities is going to be something to look at. Yes, I know many of us are dealing with the day-to-day problems, but I think in order to get this to move forward, it has to be a risk assessment to look at what is happening, what is going to will happen if you don't get into the preservation components of it, and communicate it. And as I've said earlier, strategies build in digital preservation, whether it's dealing with IT and what they're doing, because they usually have the money. So talk to them, find out what some of their long-term strategies are and ways in which some of these might be brought in. Now, Starter definitely is free, but 5 gigabytes is not going to last very long. And as we've discussed, this is sort of an evolutionary process for you. The other thing that I've put in here, and Laurie and I were talking about this yesterday, preservation has a connotation that is something old. So depending on your organization, you might need to change the terminology that you use and change how you sell the story to meet the business requirements of your particular entity that you're working in. And I think it was either Kyle or even Jillian may have mentioned it. This is not something that you can do on your own. You have to find partners within the organization who are going to work with you and build the resources. It's not just about archives. It's not just about records management. It's not just about IT. This is the institution as a whole that has its commitment in whatever its business practices are or its responsibilities, decisions, etc. And it is truly a collaborative issue that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please, Sean. So my message to you is, yes, you can look at the future, but don't wait for the future because it's here now. And there has been work going on with digital preservation for a number of years. It's not a new issue. It is probably more visible today than it has been. I know I attended a presentation recently where someone said that records management is a new activity. It was new to the person who was actually dealing with it because they were new to a software solution. So it's all a matter of perspective. This has been with us for a long time. We're very fortunate that the technology is evolving to the extent that we can get solutions and at the same time be aware of some of the concerns. So moving forward, I'd say be out there in the forefront, sell it. No, you don't have to give up what you're doing currently, but things will change around our practices and where we go moving forward. Thank you, Laurie. I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Christine. I think your point about the backlogs is very interesting because I can remember through the pandemic, one of the things that we heard from archivists was that because they were working remote or things had changed, that they were actually able to get to some of those backlogs that, you know, just sort of weigh on the mind of records managers and archivists, right? That it's out there and it hasn't been processed. But I think you bring up a really good point because also during the pandemic, a lot of systems were deployed very quickly that would support the remote workers, right? We saw Microsoft 365 go out and Teams just explode. And so that I think that the point you've made about the balancing, you know, you can't take your eyes off the backlog and what you need to do, but if you aren't jumping into where we are now, it's just sort of a slippery slope of running behind. So I think that was very brave of you to tackle that backlog issue.
Well, and I think from a records management perspective as well, I mean, there is still a lot of people who are dealing with paper-based systems because that's the policy within their organization, strange as that may be. But at the same time, IT is implementing all of these tools that have long-term retention potentially in them. And both have to be dealt with hand in hand. It's not, well, this is my domain or and that's their domain. It's no longer we've got skills that need to be shared and be communicated to make sure that even if it takes 10 years or 20 years to get there, it's building on that practice. It's almost we have to build the foundation through the communication, but be aware that it's not going to happen overnight. But like anything else, it's communicating the need for change to get people on side to provide the budget and buy the tools and get the things that are needed all the way through.
Great points. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, we're going to turn now to Aubrey, who's going to give us a quick recap on the things that were included in this series for training, and then we'll wrap up and see if there are any questions. So on to you, Aubrey.
Thanks, Lori. I'm just going to cover this super briefly because you've all been through it. So if we head to that next slide. So this is kind of essentially everything that Paul covered with you all over his training sessions. We went through the basic uploads, uploading bulk metadata, and looking at the information that comes with those preserved assets. We talked about manually adding metadata in, how to delete things and recover things from the recycle bin, and making content publicly accessible. And then again, as I mentioned, the metadata in bulk. So we really covered a wide range of things, all the things that you really need to get started on your digital preservation journey. So I think the keys here are just to get started. You know, as Paul and as many others have said, just try it out, get some files in there, test it out. And I'm kind of your person here. If you start doing these things and you've lost, you know, kind of the training that we went over, I'm here to go over that with you as well. And we can cover any issues that you might run into. But if you follow Paul's training, you should be on your way to get that digital repository started. And if you run into trouble and you know, you don't want to talk to me or you want to talk to your peers instead, if we go to that next slide, you can go to the Community Hub, which is where you can access all of the recordings and assets from the training series. So all those trainings from Paul are on there. You can rewatch them, freshen up your knowledge. If you want to, you know, sit with this for a little while and come back to it later, those trainings are up there for you to view. And then we also have how-to guides, resources on there, and a lot of your peers are on there talking about their Preservica instances, what's working, what's not, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly, that kind of thing. We think it's important to have it out there, have that transparent conversation, and we want to work with you on that Community Hub. We're paying attention, we want to engage with you, and we want to work with you to make this product as best as it can be. And you can also register for live training sessions on there. So if you wanted to snag some time with Paul, he does those training sessions pretty regularly. He does them about every 2 weeks. And then lastly, if you are going to be at SAA, we are having our user group meeting on August 24th, and you are, as starter users, welcome to join us. And that's going to start at 12 p.m. If you have any questions about that, want some more info, feel free to reach out to any of us.
Thanks, Aubrey. And I think Dara brought up a point that relates to the training session. So when we look at the list of folks who have joined the training, you represent a wide spectrum of institutions, academic, private, cultural, public sector. And so one thing that the Community Hub is really good for is that it has video recordings from different users who are in different circumstances. And Dara mentioned that you can go out and see, well, what is this person, this historian doing in a small city government, or what is this person doing in a large city who's a records manager? And so I think wherever you are in your practice and in your role in your institution, there's probably something on the Community Hub, somebody who has a similar role to you and might be especially interesting, which is, so you can kind of browse in the Community Hub and check that out. So just as we wrap up this series, this is where we've been. We hope that all of these components of the training were useful to you. Obviously, we've skimmed over a lot of deep topics to get from A to D, but we hope that's interesting, and we're here if you want to follow up or if you missed anything, if you want some additional resources, we would be happy to help you. So, and we'd happy to have other people listen to the recording too, your peers who are dealing with some of the same issues and priorities and struggles. We welcome your invitation to them to learn more about this as well. So next slide, please. So for those of you who have been able to attend all of the sessions live, you will receive a certificate from Sean in a couple of weeks once we get all the processing done. And so this is just to say you were with us and we appreciated your spending the time with us and for trying out Starter and looking at what active digital preservation can do. So look for that in your mailbox in a couple of weeks. Next slide, please. So Aubrey just mentioned Preservica usually has two user group meetings a year. One is in the UK in the spring, and then we have traditionally coordinated the US and Canadian user group meeting with the SAA conference, which is next week, the Society of American Archivists in Boston, and it's an in-person conference. But you are able to join part of the Preservica user group online, and so you can scan this code or come to the site, and we would be happy to have you there. And what they typically do in these is there are user presentations, folks who are using the various solutions that Preservica has. They also talk about what's coming in the product, what's coming on. John always talks about innovations, and it's a great session where you can just see people who are doing similar work to you and network. So we certainly, if you're going to be in Boston, please come. If you're not going to be in Boston, you can attend virtually, and we welcome you to check that out. Next slide, please. Preservica is always interested in what users need, and so there's other ways that you can get involved in what's going on in the digital preservation realm. So we've mentioned, John mentioned the Preserve 365. That's the product Preservica is working on now, which will integrate to the Microsoft 365 platform, and you can join that. And also, Preservica periodically conjoins or creates cohorts of special interests, maybe public sector, maybe a particular catalog integration or something. And so you're welcome to join in any of those and share your thoughts and communicate with your peers and find out more about what's going on and contribute your input to the product roadmap. So next slide, please. So everyone who's been on this series, whether they're with Preservica or speaking for myself and all of our guest speakers, are deeply passionate about the topics that have been presented, and we care very much about your success as a practitioner and a professional. So we hope that this has been useful, a good use of your time, that you've gained some perspective, some insights, some motivation, some enthusiasm to take your digital preservation journey forward. And we would love to hear from you. Feedback of any kind, questions that you might have. If you need to connect to one of the speakers, we're happy to help you with that. Or if you have some ideas about resources that might be useful to this community, our ears are open. So I want to thank you all so much for your time. And I don't see any questions, but let me just check with Sean and Aubrey to make sure that we're not missing anything from you. Let's just see. You guys see anything?
I think we're good.
Yeah, I don't see any.
Okay. If any questions come through, they get posted to the Community Hub with all the resources from each of these sessions. And so you'll be able to go there. So thank you once again for your time. Thank you to Dara and Christine for joining us, and to John for being with us today. Be well, stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.